Begin tonight by reaching back to the early days of contact. Bill Cameron traces how Native people lost many of the rights to their land and how they have struggled to win them back.
The eastern tip of the Gaspé Peninsula, an Indian hunting ground for many centuries, discovered by the Europeans in 1534. Discovered by Jacques Cartier, Cartier was looking for gold and diamonds and a passage to Asia. He found fool's gold and quartz and Canada and the Iroquois. On the shore of the Gaspé, Cartier reared a great wooden cross. The Iroquois chief Donnacona objected to this. With gestures, he made it clear that the Gaspé was Indian land and that Cartier should not have erected his cross without Indian permission. But the cross stayed. Here in the wet sea air of the Gaspé, you can almost hear the tone of that conversation still. The Indian amazed at the incomprehensible rudeness of the white man, at his incursion into territory that didn't belong to him. And Cartier amused, because he knew that if you have the gunpowder, you can put your cross anywhere you want. In this new world, those two men were worlds apart, and in all the years since, it seems their descendants haven't been getting any closer. Cartier died disappointed. He had no way of knowing what he'd stumbled on, but others soon found out. Canada was an immense store of timber, water, minerals, fur, farmland, a gigantic raw trove, a bonanza. It only needed taking from the people who owned it. The same kind of transaction had happened or would happen in countless other places in North and South America, Africa, Australia. But Canada was so huge, so rich, that its transfer from the Indians to the Europeans was in a class by itself. If it was a theft, it was one of the greatest thefts in history. It didn't look like a crime at first. For a century, the Indians and the Europeans worked in harmony. The Europeans wanted furs and the Indians wanted guns, cooking pots, tools, and decorations, fair trade between equal nations. Historian James Miller.
That's right. There was a very strong economic motive for cooperation. The nature of the economy was primarily commercial. It was about trade, especially the trade in furs. Indians were extremely useful. They were essential to the proper carrying on of the fur trade for the European. And so there was a very strong interaction between the two and a very profitable, mutually profitable interaction.
The Indians were profitable, useful, and faithful. They joined the White Wars. The Iroquois allied with the British against the Huron allied with the French, and each nation stayed steadfast for a century. Even the missionaries, whose fundamental purpose was to eradicate Indian culture, saw themselves in the beginning as the protectors of the Indians against oppression and exploitation. These kindly relations were even defined on paper. In 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation declaring it just and reasonable that the Indians live under royal protection without being molested and disturbed. George drew limits around his colonies. Everything west of the line, he said, was Indian land. That was the law.
It established what kind of relationship should exist between the Indian nations in British North America back then.
Historian Winona Stevenson says the proclamation is still the bedrock of Indian relations with Canada.
The British authorities, the imperial, the colonial, and eventually the federal authorities, basically stated that before any land could be alienated, it couldn't be alienated by individuals. It had to be alienated by the Crown's representative. And it had to be alienated via a formal agreement. And that's where the treaty process comes in.
But the white settlers were not lawyers. They were hungry migrants on the run from want, war, and great political change. They cleared the forest and broke the land, and their plows pushed the Indians onto reserves or into the wilderness, where they could still live a version of the life they knew, for a little while. But the energetic young government in Ottawa had great plans for the West. Prime Minister Macdonald knew this empty, endless, fertile prairie could be developed for the benefit of the East. Lower Fort Garry on the Red River in southern Manitoba. The Indians in the Canadian West were often called to places like this to be bought off or frightened off. It was called treaty making. The Indians signed away their claims to the land and got small reserves and very small payments in return. This is a later reenactment of a treaty signing. Both the whites and the Indians still thought the process important enough, fair enough, to be recorded in this way. In 1871, the Lower Fort Garry Treaty was negotiated by Lieutenant Governor Adams Archibald. During the first talks here at the Lower Fort, Archibald presented Queen Victoria's view of the situation. "Your great mother," he told the Indians, "wishes the best for all the races under her sway. She wishes her red children to be happy and contented. She wishes them to live in comfort." Underneath all that, there was one clear message. The world was changing and the whites were coming, whether the Queen's red children liked it or not. Some Indians had been newly forced to the west, but many Indians had lived on this unchanging prairie for 1,000 years. Suddenly it was being transformed around them. Incomprehensibly powerful machines towed in crowds of Europeans who spread out across the flat land and fenced off the best parts of it. The buffalo, which had given the Indians food, clothing, hides for shelter, a focus, were slaughtered by white hunters. As they disappeared, they left a vacuum at the center of native life. The Indians thought the treaties might protect them from all this. The whites thought the treaties merely made it all official. Jean Friesen, Manitoba historian.
In a sense, I think the treaties were a form of resistance from an Indian perspective. Here's the line. This is what we're prepared to accept, given the overall politics of the situation. You know, the fact that you have the railway, you've got the armed forces, and we know that you'll use them, and we've seen the American treaties, and we know what the imperial situation is. We know how things are stacked up against us. I think from the government perspective, they saw it as primarily a very large real estate deal.
The Indians saw the treaties one way, the whites saw them another. And when it was convenient, the whites violated the agreements without a second thought.
No, Canada hasn't lived up to a lot of the provisions that it delineated in the treaties.
Historian Winona Stevenson has a long list of government violations.
If some provisions have been lived up to, others haven't been. Canada, under all the treaties, Canada was supposed to protect our right to hunt and trap in unoccupied Crown lands. Hasn't done that. Canada was supposed to provide education for Indian peoples equivalent to the educational standard that other Canadians get. Canada hasn't done that. I mean, the recent post-secondary education crisis showed that. Canada was required to set aside a certain amount of land for each band. I mean, we have treaty land entitlement cases in the courts and before the Office of Native Claims right now. Obviously, Canada hasn't lived up to that.
Over the years, the Indians held to their view of the treaties. Their increasingly tiny yearly payments were a token of a bond between nation and nation. To the whites, increasingly, all this was merely folklore, but not to the Indians. A promise was a promise.
There continues to be a lot of thought that those treaties are extremely important today.
George Erasmus is the president of the Assembly of First Nations.
The basic impression of treaties is that they were a deal between two peoples, two collectives, nations, if you will, and that it was government-to-government relationships.
The first treaties were in place by the 1850s. Others followed the spread of settlement across the country. But in the end, in the far west, the whites rarely bothered with treaties. They just shoved the Indians aside. The Nass Valley in northwestern British Columbia, along the Alaskan border. Imagine what it would be like to own this land and lose it. The Nisga'a Indians, who now live in a tiny square of Nass Valley land, still remember when the white surveyors first showed up here.
They were very strange people. For some of the Nisga'a, it was the first time they'd ever seen, a white man.
Chief Bert McKay's grandfather saw the surveyors at work. He didn't like them.
They were tall people dressed in black with huge beards and big wide-brimmed hats. And apparently One of the things that the chieftain and Ians noticed was they were very domineering, very pushy.
The Nisga'a always resisted the pushiness, never signed a treaty, fought even as the land disappeared around them. They sent delegates to plead their case in Ottawa, even in London. But when the grandees of those distant governments considered the Nisga'a case, they always gave more weight to the white politicians on the scene.
You had settlers making Indian policy rather than a distant imperial or Ottawa government. And settler governments are the ones which have the most immediate interest in Indian land. And so that when they came to make Indian policy in British Columbia, they were not interested in purchasing land from Indians, so that in British Columbia what you had is no treaties, that is no recognition of Aboriginal title, and very small reserves established, not on the basis of transfer of title at all, but simply more or less a grace and favor, and on a very small acreage basis.
When we return, trying to survive in the white man's new world.
Schwarzenegger's a cop. Nothing scares him. Nothing stops him. But now...
they're all yours.
What's the matter?
I have a headache.
It might be a tumor.
It's not a tumor. From Ivan Reitman, Kindergarten Cop. They're horrible.
Starts Friday, December 21st at theaters everywhere.
In a recent survey, an average of 94% of Corolla owners said that given the opportunity to do it again, they'd gladly buy another one. The new Toyota Corolla, perhaps its greatest virtue, is that it rewards loyalty with loyalty.
I thought you had an important meeting.
I do. Happy birthday, Dad.
The promise.
Oh.
I'll be home for Christmas. You can plan on me. Please have snow and mistletoe.
Home Hardware has the perfect Christmas gift. The Braun Butane Curling Iron is $22.99 and refill butane cartridges are $4.79. Come home for Christmas. Home Hardware.
From the Fort Macleod, Alberta Gazette, June 15th, 1886. Indian loafers in town are again becoming an abominable nuisance. These Indians prowl around at all hours of the night. They get into haystacks and under buildings and smoke, and the first thing we know, they will set the town on fire. These Indians have no earthly right to come and loaf about town. In those days, in the Canadian West, you could not hear the word Indian without hearing the word problem right after it. It was up to the federal government to come up with a solution. It came up with regulations that evolved into the Indian Act.
The purpose was to permit Indians to cease being Indians. The extinguishment of Indians as Indians was what was aimed for. The argument for that was that, of course, once Indians ceased to be Indians, that expense would be reduced for the federal government.
The West was now farmland, so the Indians were told to farm. And in fact, many Indians showed some talent for this. They began to produce large crops at respectable profits. Their white neighbors didn't like this at all. A new study by historian Sarah Carter records how their success was punished.
at this time, when they began to do so, there was all kinds of calls that from local people, local non-native settlers, that this was unfair competition, that they began to lobby their members of parliament, and they also assailed local Department of Indian Affairs officials and visiting officials that this was unfair competition. And I think that this sort of pressure was crucial in devising a policy that was put in place beginning in the late 1880s that was intended to eliminate Aboriginal farmers on reserves from competing with their with the white settlers, with the newcomer farmers.
Hayter Reed had a solution for this. The Deputy Commissioner of Indian Affairs had a theory. The Indian would have to evolve from hunter to peasant and only then to modern man. So in 1888, Reed decided that the new peasant Indians could work their soil only with hand implements, no machinery.
In fact, a lot of bands owned Massey Ferguson farm machinery long before their European settler neighbors did. But that wasn't the kind of farming Indian Affairs wanted Indians to do. And they made it against the law, one, for Indians to take out loans to buy farm machinery. They made it against the law for Indian people to kill any of their own livestock. They made it against the law for Indian people to sell their produce off reserve. They made it against the law for Indians to leave the reserve. And so basically what they did was undermine everything that Indian peoples had built.
Of course, this led to disaster and starvation, and when it did, it was considered proof the Indians would never learn.
For the reserves that were in prime agricultural land right along the line of the Canadian Pacific Railway, there began concerted campaigns to have them give up their land. And this is, in a sense, why I feel that maybe this peasant policy was also in some sense linked to this. I've called it the prelude to surrender, because if they could be shown not to be productively using their land, this was always the ancient rationale that was used for dispossessing them of their land. And in fact, the policy did function this way.
It was the same in many places, the same pattern repeated. You're in the fishing grounds off the north coast of British Columbia, when Indian fishermen began to compete with whites late last century. Somebody passed a regulation.
There were two kinds of fishing licenses in those days. If you had an independent license, you could sell your fish to anyone. But if your license was attached, you could sell only to one outlet. The Indians were allowed only the attached kind. It was felt that two bad things might happen if they got their hands on independent licenses. First, they might compete more effectively with the whites, and second, the Japanese might want them too.
It's a big ocean. The whites, the Japanese, Canadians, and the Indians all found room to fish in it. But the Indians had a special burden, a government intent on transforming them into whites by regulation. Assimilation. It was government policy, and this was its main instrument. The residential school would raise Indian children in isolation, grind the Indianness out of them, make them brown adults with white interiors. Behind the smiles for the 1936 camera was a purgatory of loneliness, dislocation, harsh discipline, sometimes brutality.
One of the tragic things about the boarding school policy is that it took children at such a very young age, at the age of 3 or 4, to boarding schools and never returned home until they were 18 or 19. It was a deliberate policy to take the Indian child from the family, because when the child was on the reserve and within its own family, it was, as the government saw at the time, in danger of sliding back into savagery. Day schools didn't work. Day schools didn't have the same kind of force of assimilation and incorporation into another society that the boarding schools did. And so the real purpose of the boarding schools, in my view, was to separate the child from the family.
The schools were sealed to save on heat, so diseases passed through easily. One civil servant said that only half the children educated in these places lived to get any benefit from them. The toll was even higher in the far north, where in the 1930s the Inuit began to catch white diseases as the Indians in the south had been doing for centuries. In 1930, a Scottish doctor named Russell Martin came to Coppermine and found an Inuit society bursting with life and health.
As far as I could make out, they'd never had the ordinary diseases that we have. They'd never had any traces of heart disease or high blood pressure or that sort of thing. They were perfectly fit, and there's really no illness until we brought it in.
It came in on a boat bringing supplies from the south, and a prisoner, a convicted murderer who had caught tuberculosis in a southern prison. The Inuit had no resistance to tuberculosis, and their intimate way of life spread the disease effortlessly. The Coppermine death register shows what happened. Within 10 years, 200 people had died of tuberculosis.
I felt desperate that I couldn't do anything. And if there was anything to be done, I'd have to get some help from the south.
But when the planes arrived from the south, they carried no medical supplies for Dr. Martin. And when Martin went to Ottawa to plead for help to stop the epidemic, he was fired. The Inuit thought all this was the work of evil spirits. Maybe they were right. Over the years, the Southerners kept returning to the North whenever it was worth their while to do it. And so it became necessary for the Canadian government to make some legal arrangement with the people who held the land. Treaties again. Father René Fumelot is an oblate priest who first came to the North in the early 1950s. He's a historian, and he studied the Northern treaties. He says the white negotiators often said one thing and wrote another.
You know, this mentality in these days is that we can sign any treaty. The government could promise anything, it doesn't matter much, because that's a vanishing race. The Indians were the vanishing race, and you find many official documents saying, you know, why should we bother? Indian problems will solve themselves out. Just wait till everybody dies, and there won't be any problem.
It didn't work out that way. When we return, fighting back.
This is me before I got the itch. Huh?
And I said to Rel, I've got the itch and I've got it bad. He said nothing, absolutely nothing. Well, you know how he is, don't forget it.
Instant lottery games have a better than 1 in 4 chance of winning.
I'm 82 years old and never thought I'd get the itch.
So when you get the itch, just scratch. There's a new pet.
Chia.
Chia Pet, the pottery that grows. It's fun and easy. Soak your chia, spread the seeds, keep it watered, and watch it grow. And now grow a whole collection of fun with chia teddy bears, puppies, kittens, rams, bulls. There's even a chia tree to keep your pets company. Chia Pets and Trees, the pottery that grows.
Chia Pets and Chia Trees are available at Woolco, Zellers, Kmart, and Eden's. Makes a perfect gift.
Blue Rodeo, Gowan, and a special reunion of Max Webster. Join Q107 and CBC Television for a special stereo simulcast of the Toronto Music Awards, Thursday night at 11:30.
Spring 1885. A massive contingent of Canadian soldiers is moving west. There's been an uprising on the prairies. Métis and Indians, enraged by hunger and broken promises, have gone into battle to enforce their claims. Their leader, the Métis Louis Riel, visionary, forceful, often somewhat mad. His Indian allies, Big Bear and Poundmaker, dubious about the whole enterprise. The expeditionary force broke the Métis resistance at Batoche on May 12, 1885. Riel achieved his martyrdom. His Indian allies were forgotten, while his Métis became ageless heroes.
Yes, they are the popular symbol of native resistance to Europeans, but Aboriginal resistance has been there from the beginning. We've tended to dramatize certain events. And even in the Riel Rebellion, for example, Riel was hanged. Yes, he was hanged as a traitor, but there were 6 Indians hanged at the same time, the largest, as one writer suggested, the largest mass hanging in Canadian history. And yet that's obscured.
In the early years of the 20th century, some Indians in British Columbia began to fight in the white way. The Nisga'a elders organized committees and raised money to pay for lawsuits. The white politicians thought this was dangerous and annoying, and Ottawa put a stop to it.
Between roughly 1900 and 1927, Ottawa had been given a very tough time by Indians in British Columbia who were becoming increasingly organized politically. But Ottawa was so heartily sick of having to deal with this problem that they thought, well, we'll just make it more difficult for them to lobby about land claims question. We'll make it a crime to raise money or to contribute money to an Indian organization for these purposes.
The Second World War changed much of this. Canadian Indian soldiers were being shipped overseas to serve alongside Canadians of other races. Canadian Indian soldiers were dying in a war with an enemy who judged the value of human beings by the color of their skins, dying in numbers and with great courage. After a war like that, a peace with continued official bigotry made no sense. So in 1951, the government of Louis Saint Laurent made some changes to the Indian Act. Some changes. Historian James Miller.
The 1951 amendment largely changed details without changing the substance or underlying purpose of the Indian Act. The amendment in 1951 removed some of the worst transgressions of the rights and freedoms of Indians. For example, it removed the prohibition on consumption of alcohol by Indians. It also removed the prohibition on raising funds for the pursuit of land claims or political purposes by Indians. A provision had been implemented in 1927. But it did not change the underlying idea that eventually Indians would become non-Indians.
John Diefenbaker changed a little more. He felt his new Bill of Rights should apply to Indians too. So in 1960, at last, Indians got the right to vote in federal elections. The succeeding Liberals seemed to want to go further. Under Jean Chrétien, the Minister of Indian Affairs, there were extensive meetings with Indian leaders who made the case again and again for Aboriginal rights. The Liberals produced a white paper that rejected them.
Our answer is no. We can't recognize Aboriginal rights because no society can be built on historical might-have-beens. We must forget many things if we want to live together as Canadians.
Again, the Indians said they were being asked to merge into Canada. Jean Chrétien was inviting them to disappear.
Indian peoples were absolutely appalled. They were absolutely appalled at everything that they had said to him, and all of this sharing that had gone on during this consultation process was either totally disregarded or misread and misunderstood. And it was the first time in our history, in our recent history, that Indian peoples from across Canada united on a single issue, the denouncement of that policy, and rallied. It was a phenomenal time in our history because it did bring us together.
Can the white man produce documents and bill of sales for this land which he's claiming? It's up to him, in my opinion, to prove his ownership, not us. We know we own it since time of memory.
The Nisga'a people of British Columbia had never stopped pursuing their claim, and in 1973 they were told they could put their case to the Canadian courts. Chief Frank Calder organized the suit on behalf of the Nisga'a Nation. It went to the provincial Supreme Court, and it lost. It went to the Canadian Supreme Court and lost, but also won.
In the end, though technically they lost, really in the stream of history, it was a victory because the idea of Aboriginal rights was adopted by the Supreme Court of Canada. That is, that Aboriginal title is part of the Canadian law, part of the vocabulary of Canadian law.
Vancouver lawyer Tom Berger argued the Nisga'a case before the Canadian Supreme Court.
Mr. Trudeau, who was then Prime Minister, not a man given to acknowledge error, said I was wrong. When in 1969 I said Aboriginal rights are too shadowy to be the basis for any contemporary form of recognition. He said I was wrong. The Supreme Court of Canada has persuaded me that we've got to sit down and negotiate a settlement.
So when the Quebec government was preparing to flood a huge tract of northern land for the James Bay Power Project, it had to negotiate a deal with the James Bay Cree, the first modern land claim settlement. And by the 1980s, Native negotiators were meeting government negotiators apparently as equals. They won a general victory when they persuaded Ottawa to recognize Aboriginal rights in the 1982 Constitution. Then they went into battle to hammer out the specifics. What did those rights mean in law, in practice, and in cash? 4 meetings on that went very slowly.
There's something that's happening, and it's of grave concern to me, is that as soon as we get close to doing something, there seems to be almost a strategy to prevent something from happening.
There's certainly no justification suspecting that anyone at this end of the table is trying to drag things on so they'll get no results.
But at the other end of the table, there was a logjam.
You wouldn't have much chance in the next
3 Western provinces refused to accept a constitutional amendment that would enshrine the Aboriginal right to self-government. End of discussion.
One day, we shall succeed. But this constitutional process has now come to an end.
Is the will of the House to sit beyond 12:30?
And in time, a Canadian Indian replied by ending a constitutional process himself.
Hello?
Feast night at Greenville. A celebration for an old man of the Nisga'a Nation who's gone through a dangerous operation and survived. Fresh clams in the chowder. The salt of the sea for people who have lost almost all their land. Who can blame the white man for wanting this? Who can blame the Indian for fighting to get it back? This is Bill Cameron in the Nass Valley for the Journal.